This is an unrehearsed program. The views expressed are those of the guests and not necessarily those of the producer. Today's topic:
How to confront dictators in Passion for Truth award-winning program.
Welcome to another edition of Passion for Truth. If violence leads to more violence and wars do more harm than good, then how should we confront the aggressors and dictators? Should we try pacifism instead of violence? All next with our panelists: Jay Bryan, Virginia State Senator; Sardar Ganga Singh Dillon, researcher on critical issue affecting India and Pakistan; George Nestruchek with Nestruchek and Associates, a former staff director for the U.S. House of Representatives. Mr. Nestruchek is originally from Ukraine and has first-hand knowledge of freedom-fighting movements and international law. Dr. Dennis Warner from Pax Christi, the International Catholic Peace Movement. Dr. Warner, as a senior advisor, has worked in more than 50 countries for a variety of international, governmental and private organizations. Welcome you all.
Thank you.
Starting with you, Senator Bryan, what do you think? Do you think the disastrous consequences of wars are often overlooked in the histories if the victors write those histories?
Well, that's an interesting notion, but yes, indeed, victors do write the histories, but I think perhaps the most definitive war that most of us can recall in terms of the history is World War II. And the disastrous consequence of war was saving the peace. So it's very, very difficult to make presumptions about war versus peace. In many cases, perhaps most, war is a disastrous consequence, as you define in your question, but sometimes they are necessary to bring about a more lasting peace for our people. In terms of the histories that are written about them, for instance, going back to World War II, some would say that the Japanese have neglected their difficult contribution to World War II in their own history books. And it's only time itself that brings about the exposure of problems that led to war, the behavior of the warriors or the peacemakers, and it's only through time that we come to a full resolution.
Sardar Dillon, imagine if we had offered nonviolence resistance to Nazis.
Well, so far the philosophy of nonviolence of Mahatma Gandhi is concerned, which you are referring to. Nonviolence people adopt only when they have no other means. Nonviolence means helplessness. When people have the courage, people have the strength, and people have the objective, then non-violence has no place. The history is full of with the examples. If non-violence happened to be, Chamberlain tried non-violence in World War II, and what was the result? Eventually, the dictator has to be met with the same commitment and with the same strength. He wanted to overrule the world.
George, if you know that many religions did not survive because of nonviolence, what's your view?
Well, that brings a whole different realm to the discussion. Religions usually dictate certain moral precepts in society, and usually those are difficult to reconcile with violence. But I think the premise of violence versus nonviolence, you can't do in an abstract out of context. If you are dealing with a regime that retains its power and authority through violent means and through terrorism, terrorizing its society, I don't see how nonviolence can possibly be brought to bear to force a change on that kind of a regime. Their precepts are basically violent. I don't see how else you can overthrow them but through violence. If you have a regime that tries to present itself or impose a set of values that are rooted in nonviolence and resorts to violence from time to time, you can possibly shame them into changing their behavior. But those are really have to be evaluated in the right context.
What's your take, Dennis?
Well, the issue you brought up, you sometimes can shame them, is a key here, because there are some well-documented cases where nonviolence against an oppressor did work. Certainly the case of Indian independence is one outstanding example, but there are others like that. It was also mentioned World War II and the Germans. Well, the case of the Danes against the German occupation was basically nonviolent, and they basically were able to maintain their dignity and their sense of self-respect. And in turn, the Germans treated them better than they did other areas. But the Danes did not have a history during the war of violent resistance to the occupation. It was very nonviolent. There are some other instances of this also. The American civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s was basically nonviolent, and the nonviolent approaches did work. They seem to work where the oppressor has some sense of human rights, where they accept certain standards. Where the oppressor does not have this, then nonviolence doesn't work, and it can be crushed.
I would like to take an issue on the India's example and the Indian independence on 1947. That's a myth that it was Mahatma Gandhi's nonviolence which brought the independence to India. That's not true. It was the rebellion of the forces under the command of the Sikhs who rose up in Burma against the British. It was the rebellion in the police of the Indian forces in India who rose up to the British regime, and they fought hard. The INA, Indian National Army, was organized in Burma, and they fought with the British, and the British came to realize that the forces and the strategy with which they were ruling India is in danger. And that's why, and third role was played by the United States when the president of USA was Truman, to force the British to relinquish and give the freedom to the Indians. It was not Mahatma Gandhi's nonviolence policy, no.
Senator Bryan, is that does that make sense that unless the aggressors have some idea of human rights, unless they have a little philosophy along the lines of compassion, that nonviolence would not work?
Well, the example you gave, Doctor, of the civil rights movement is perfect in this context, because the public was brought to shame, to consider their relations with a minority community within that country. And but it wasn't under a dictatorship that sought to, I don't think, it was a democracy that was led, perhaps kicking and screaming in southern states, to come to a correct way of thinking about their fellow man. Compare that to the Germans, whose idea of civil rights was extermination of a whole religion. And they had to be brought to their knees by force. So a passive notion of dealing with oppression in World War II, or in that context, would never have worked. And so we bring that discussion to today, to the dictators that we see around the world. And I don't think they're, the head of North Korea is going to come to any reform by the passive nature of his subjects, but rather by a world community that won't allow him to budge on the international stage if he does anything wrong. And hopefully that's the context that some of our current dictators and oppressors are brought to see normality in the human relations.
You're right. Nonviolence only works where the oppressor has a sense of human rights.
Right.
That's why it worked in the U.S. and why it worked in India. The Indian revolutionary